Hi, this is Ken Forkish. So in my new cookbook, it's all bread recipes that give you, most of them, you can make one dough and you can make it into a pain loaf, or you can make it into a beautiful Dutch oven loaf. And I want to show you how to remove the dough from the bucket and how to shape the loaf. Just a little bit about that. One thing I'd like to point out is in each of the recipes in this cookbook, I tell you the timeline after it was mixed, about how long until it reaches its mark on the side. You ultimately judge by the amount of rise for when it's ready to remove and at the end of when it's at the end of its first rise. But it's good to have a timeline, and you'll learn that in your environment what the normal time is, and you can pretty much count on it and say, don't have to overly obsess about is it there yet. And what I do as a reminder, and I suggest you do the same, is just to write on a piece of tape on the lid of your dough bucket what time the mix ended and what the temperature of the dough was. And then if you know that it's going to be 3 hours and 15 minutes till it's ready, then you can pretty much just set your clock by that. But otherwise, most of us are going to forget when the dough mix. So it's a handy reminder that I think you'll find really useful. I want you to, well, I always do this. I flour the surface before removing the dough, and then you want the dough to come out of the bucket in a way that's real gentle. You can't just grab it and pull it. You'll damage the gluten in the dough. And it's kind of delicate at this stage because it's had this nice rise. You can see what it looks like on the top. I like to sprinkle flour around the edges and then work it down in with my hand, and you can see how nicely it removes or releases from the edge of the bucket. You don't need to obsess about this, just pull it out. You can see what my hands are doing here is I'm just releasing it from the bottom of the dough bucket, and you can see these threads, that's what you don't want to break. And then I just gradually pull it out. It's all done. And we're going to shape this one into what the French will call a miche, which means it's a round. And then this is like in my first book, Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast, where it'll rise in a wicker bread basket, or any kind of basket. It could be, it could be a big bowl that you line with flour, or maybe a tea towel lined with flour. It doesn't have to be one of these, but these are really nice because they handle the moisture of the dough well. The dough's not likely to stick to it unless it's super wet. Blah, blah, blah. I like to give it a little bit of flour lining so that when it's ready, it'll pop out and release from the basket. And you can see what that looks like in here. And if you have a brand new basket, be real generous with the flour. Don't clean them. You can tamp them out like that when you're done. And just let them dry out in a dry place. So to shape these, flour your hands nicely. Grab the dough always from underneath. That's the dry part of the dough. This top part's a little bit sticky, and that's the challenge for a lot of new bakers at home or at the bakery, is learning how to handle sticky dough. And the trick is use the flat parts of your hands, not the tips of your fingers. Grab it from the dry part, which is always the part that was facing down and on the floured surface. And then you stretch and fold, stretch and fold. See how disorganized it's looking, but stretch and fold. You just grab each end like that. I say quarters because you have to describe it somehow in the narrative of the book. But stretch and fold, and you can see how it's forming a tight round. And then I like to I want to get a little grit on the surface. So I put that side down, and then I'm just going to grab it with my pinkies pushing down and pulling forward toward me at the same time. And you can probably see how that tightened it up. And I do the same thing 2 or 3 times. Right, 4, I lied. And then I set it on just a little bit of flour, and then place it into the basket. C'est tout. There's one difference in these loaves versus the loaves in my first bread book. They are a little bit bigger, and I just want you to be aware of that. They have about an extra 3 to 3.5 ounces of dough if you use the levain culture. If you don't use the levain culture, and it's optional for almost all of the recipes in the book except for brioche, and there's Japanese milk bread. They're really good too. You don't have to have the levain culture to make the bread. It'll taste better if you have it, but you have the choice to join it with or without the levain culture. And I like to think of it as you do it the straight dough without the levain culture while it's being built up. And that takes about a week to do. It's not very much work, and your bread, you're really going to be happy if you do it. Anyway, I digress. So once it's shaped, because it's a little bit more dough than what you might be used to if you've been baking bread from my first book, is it's going to be a little bit bigger in the form and has, I don't want it to stick to the baggie that you're going to put over it to keep it from drying out. So my trick, this is the same with the pan bread, is just put a very light film of water on the top of the loaf. You're not hurting anything. And then put it in a baggie. I use the vegetable bags from produce store, from the market, or from the farmer's market, wherever you shop. And then this will be ready to bake in about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. But using the bag will keep it from drying out. So that's it. Next thing you want to do is preheat the oven with the Dutch oven in it. And for this, it's the same baking instructions as in my first book. It'll be 475 degrees for about half an hour with the lid on. You take the lid off, another 20 minutes, and then remove it from the oven when it has the right color. So don't do it strictly on the clock. We'll do that. Nice. So as I mentioned before, one dough recipe can make two completely different breads, the pan breads or Dutch oven loaf. That's one of my favorite aspects of these recipes. It was a happy accident I learned when I was testing. I mentioned that these loaves are a little bit larger than the flour, water, salt, yeast loaves if you use the levain culture in the dough mix, which you know I highly encourage. So it's take the plastic wrap off, kind of flour dust your counter, give this a firm wrap, and then sometimes it might stick a little bit to the basket. See how I keep the basket here and I just use my hands to release any parts that are clinging a little bit more than I intended to the basket, but that's going to happen to all of us sometimes. And so instead of reshooting this video for you, I want to show you, hopefully that got the point across. And then I like to have flour in my hands for this part. I'm going to put it into the preheated Dutch oven, which I'll put right here. No TV magic today, right? I'm still doing it the way I had you do it in your first book. You just pick it up in place. Put the lid back on. Always use oven mitts or towels. Make sure your kitchen towels, if you use them, are like triple folded over so I don't want you to hurt yourself. You can use the parchment methods. They work just fine. I chose not to. I wanted to just keep everything as simple and as close to the first book as far as process goes. So I just stick with that method that works just fine. But if you're nervous about it, parchment methods, there's a million of them online. It's easy to find how to do that. Then pop it back into the oven. And you're good to go. Baked just the same as they do in flour, water, salt, yeast. 30 minutes, take the lid off, another 20 minutes, 475 to 500 degrees. It'll be a nice crusty loaf of bread that looks just like this. Happy baking.